Everybody, it's Kislev at the Veld. It's Kislev. Last week I said I would tell some yarning about it's Kislev. I have to make good on that statement. There's a story, and I think it happened in the 1970s. There was a chassid. He was known as Rabbi Jimmy Gorari. He was a famous chassid. He was one of the chassidim that in the 1950s encouraged the Rebbe to take on the Messias, to become Rebbe. He wrote a Kislev his kashrus in the year 1950. And he was traveling, I think, to Brazil at the time. And he was about to get on a flight, and the flight was delayed. And he had forgotten something in his house. And it says in Svarim, in the Sefer of Tzavos, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, that if you forget something, you're about to go on a trip, you shouldn't go back to get it. Some kind of a spiritual thing. I don't know the exact reason. I think it's not considered to be good for you. So he wanted to go back to get it, but he was concerned about this. So he called up the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Benjamin Klein, and asked him to ask the Rebbe what to do. And the Rebbe gave an answer and told Rabbi Klein to tell him that he should learn the Perek Tanya. Because Nachdom was learn the Perek Tanya, after learning a Perek Tanya, wird man an andere Mensch, become a new person. So it's not the same person that was traveling originally, therefore you're obviating the concern about going back. And then the Rebbe told Rabbi Klein to call back Rabbi Geradi and tell him, ich mein das, I don't just mean this as a nice Hasidic word, ich mein das kipshut, I mean it literally. We see the power of learning Tanya, it literally transformative, it transforms us. The word Tanya is also the same Oisius as Asan, which means the mighty one. If you scramble the letters, it spells the word Asan, which means the mighty one. And it's also noteworthy is that the first three words of Tanya Mashpiyam Oisai, yes, Tanya Mashpiyam Oisai spells the word Emes, right? Tanya Mashpiyam Oisai, Aleph Mem of Emes. Bereshis Bora Elikim, the Tanya is Rashi Tevis Emes, meaning the first letters or the first three words spell Emes. In the Chumash, which is not Pnimis HaTorah, it's Sofi Tevis Emes. The last three letters of the first three words spell Emes. Because in Tanya, Chassidus, of course, is Begolah. Godliness is more revealed. The Chumash and in Halacha and Yonim comes down more into the physical. And another word, I think I said this last week, if I didn't, again, Tanya begins with a tough. A person starts to learn Tanya, they think they're already holding by a top and Avodas Hashem, they're well on their way. And then they come, and then the last letter of the first section of Tanya, V'Likutei Amarim, it's an Aleph. So it's telling us that after learning Tanya, we see that we're holding by Aleph. We're in Avodas Hashem. We're at the beginning of our journey. Okay. Some of the verse on Tanya. There's also a story with I don't remember, I think it was of Yehuda Lev HaKoyen. Abdush Anapoli, Yehuda Lev HaKoyen he wrote an approbation on the Tanya. They met in Anapoli on the way. And when the Tanya first got published, and they were so excited by the Sefer, they were just, the whole streets of, I think the Lashon is that the streets of Anapoli were on fire. The fire of Torah consumed them there. There was a tremendous joy. There's many other stories about Tanya. I'll share with you another story about Tanya that I read. There was happening with Rabbi Yor. Rabbi Yor he's the father of the prison family. He was Mashpia on the Babich in the times of the Jew Kedeba. He was in prison, and at the time when he was in prison, he was a young man, he was a young Mashpia at the time, in his 20s, I believe. And he had committed to memory like the first 52 Prakim of Tanya. He knew that by heart. that time, at that young age. Then he was in the prison cell. There was a fire in the prison cell. He, Baruch Hashem, was unscathed. He was not harmed. He came back. He found he had a Tanya with him. Only the pages of Tanya that he already knew by heart were burned. The rest of Tanya was still b'shleimus. All right, there's a lot to bring about, but it's just a little a teaser, if we will, a taste, a tima. It was also my son's birthday, my youngest, Yaakov. Okay, now we're going to start from Hilchos B'Shalachim, page Samachay, page 65. So I believe we started getting into the subject last week. Did we do Halach Aleph? Anybody remember?
I remember we divided it. Foods were raw nature, foods were edible raw fine.
Right. Okay, I'm just going to quickly review it. So Aleph Kederach Hilchos B'Shalachim Perek Revi'i Kederach Sha'aseh Chacham Pasakim, just like the Rabbi said, Pasakim is not allowed to eat. In Osru, Gam B'Shalachim, also cooked foods by a non-Jew are not permitted. Lachein Chumash B'Shal Anochri, anything that a non-Jew cooks. Also Sheikh Leni Yisrael, Jews not allowed to consume. We explained before, the prohibition of Bishalakum is worse, stronger than Bishalakum. I'm sorry, the other way around. The prohibition of Bishalakum is stronger than Pasakum. Because the prohibition of Bishalakum was accepted by all Jewish communities alike. And also, this whole idea we say that bread is our sustenance, it's our lifeblood, so to speak. We don't say that by regular foods. We say by bread. Even a non-Jew is a baker. They bake something, they cook something with intent, to sell to others. Cooked foods are not allowed, they're prohibited. Isa Bishalakum, the prohibition of Bishalakum, Gamu Gzeira Mishum Eschatnos, also a prohibition because of concern of intermarriage. Shema Yazminu Hanochi, Lachalim Bevesei, Yavel Eschatanim. Maybe a non-Jew is going to come and invite us, eat in their home. We're going to come to intermarriage, either with ourselves or with our children to their children. That's the reason most of the poskim can bring down. The Rambam brings down, and Rashi bring it down. There's a secondary opinion that says, the secondary reason brought down is that the issue of Bishul Akum is because maybe the non-Jew is going to put some forbidden food in the mix. And therefore, it's a problem. Now, this secondary reason is very, very telling, because according to the first reason, that we're concerned about intermarriage. So when it comes to a non-Jew, if you have a non-Jew cooking for a Jew, you have that concern. What happens if you have a non-religious Jew? A non-religious Jew is allowed to marry a Jew. They're both Jews, no problem. So therefore, according to that reason, it wouldn't be a problem for a non-religious Jew to turn on the fire to cook something. But according to the secondary reason, Shema Yachelen Dover Asur, maybe something non-kosher will get mixed into the mix. That reason would apply. Someone who's not religious, doesn't keep kosher, is not going to have the sensitivity, the requisite sensitivity to be able to oversee that. Which is why it's better that you should have a religious Jew turn on the fire for Bishul Yisrael. However, if one's in a situation that's challenging, one could be lenient and have a non-religious Jew turn on the fire for Bishul Yisrael, as long as we know that the non-religious Jew is the one who turned on the fire, not somebody else. Therefore, the food would be Bishul Yisrael. Now, in Gimel, we get into as I said, we have the umbrella categories, meaning the reason for this prohibition is to prevent intermarriage. But the structure, the subject of what's prohibited, what's not prohibited, is different from that of Pas. And we're going to explain that there are two stipulations, two things that have to be in place in order for something to qualify as a food that has to be made bishul yisrael. For example, if I have a food that's edible in the raw state, for example, apples, carrots, if you want to be like a bunny rabbit, right? Carrots, you can eat them raw. Even if you don't want to be like a bunny rabbit, you can eat them. So those, technically speaking, don't have to be cooked by a Jew because they're edible in their raw state. So if a non-Jew cooked tzimmus, we took carrots and cooked it, we don't have to make a big tzimmus about it. The tzimmus means a fuss. But we don't. But technically, it's allowed. And it may not be a good idea because they might come to cook other foods. They might start cooking potatoes, which will be a problem. Other foods. I'm not saying it's advisable, but technically speaking, they're allowed to cook tzimmus according to the strict letter of the law. The same would be they're allowed to cook applesauce because the apples are edible in the raw state. The Chai Adam brings down, one of the halachic authorities bring down that the reason why if a food is edible in the raw state, it's not required to be bishul yisrael, is because there isn't that effect of indebtedness. Like, oh wow, you took something that's not edible, you took a raw piece of steak or a frozen piece of meat, which is like a rock. If you don't have any cooking apparatuses, we're not going to be able to eat frozen meat or raw meat. And you took something that was inedible and you made it edible. So there's a very strong feeling of indebtedness, of a feeling of gratitude, which we're afraid could lead to the intermarriage. But if you take a food that's edible the way it is, like an apple or carrots, and you change the way it's eaten now it's eaten as a cooked dish, so it's like a big deal. I could have eaten it this way or that way. There isn't that same sense of indebtedness or wow effect. Yeah.
What about like apple crumble? Like, I guess apple's the main thing, but there's also like flour and things that are in it that you couldn't eat.
So that would get into the question of, first of all, what's the main ingredient, and then if the food would be the type of food that would be served at a king's table. Because the secondary qualification is that it has to be the kind of food that would be served at a king's table. When we say king's table, dafka, we don't specifically mean only a king's table. We mean be served at a fancy venue, be served at a wedding, at a state dinner, right? The Rambam has a fascinating definition. He says, Adam, the type of food, Adam Shamaz Mechaveri Allah. You invite your friend over to come and eat. So, for example, let's say it's raining outside, or snowing, it's inclement weather, and you call up your friend and say, you want to come, and she's got an apartment on the other side of town. You're on Eastern Parkway, she's on Lefferts. And you say, you want to come over to my house and have some Rice Krispies and milk? She'll be like, no, thanks. I got that in my apartment. I don't need that. But if you say to her, I just made roast potatoes and chicken, I made a whole succulent supper, she's like, what time is supper being served? Thank you very much, I'm coming. So the point is that the food would be the goydem, would be the draw. It's the kind of food that doesn't have that chashivos. I'll eat it in my own house. No, I don't need to come for that. I once had a fascinating discussion with a Rav. I was traveling, I had this chus to travel over upstate New York. I went on an overnight trip with a Rav, very chashuv place. We were discussing this topic. So, you go to a hotel and a lot of hotels will give you free breakfast in the morning. So sometimes they have the dried cereals in separate boxes, they're kosher parv, you can take them. So I discussed it. I said, you're going to a hotel and they're serving you the cereal. They're serving it. So we came to the conclusion that nobody's coming to the hotel to get the breakfast cereals. You're coming to the hotel because you need a place to stay, place to sleep. Since they're charging you $150, $180, whatever the price is, they want to make it attractive. So they're also going to say, I'm going to give you some breakfast in the morning. But nobody's coming just for the breakfast. Therefore, it's not a raya, it's not a proof that the dried cereal is chashuv. Okay, Gimel, Tanai be'isr b'shalakim. Shnei Tanai misnu chazal be'isr b'shalakim. Two stipulations. Should be the kind of food that still needs to be cooked, meaning it's not edible in its raw state. It's not something you can eat raw. It's not possible. If it'll be something you can eat raw. Now we turn to page Samachvav. Then there is no credence, there's no great sense of indebtedness or wow effect. Oh wow, you cooked an apple for me, or you cooked a carrot for me. No. So it's considered as if the Nadra didn't do anything because the food was edible prior to their activity. By the way, I had a colleague, former colleague of mine, he was an older man, he already passed away, but he told me that in Europe, when he was a child, he said people did not eat carrots raw. So then, in that case, in that country, then it would have to be made b'shel Yisrael. If it's a country that doesn't eat it raw, today we do. The kind of food that you would serve at a fancy venue. Something that's not so chashuv. It's not a really royal type of food. This is the Rambam's definition. A person wouldn't invite their friend over to come and eat that. And they're not going to come to intermarriage because the food's not a chashuv of food. For example, like popcorn. It's a snack food, not a chashuv of food. You go to a fancy event, people are not eating popcorn. It's considered to be, it cheapens the effect. Point the second reason that we said, since it's not someone you would invite your friend over, I'm not going to come to give you something that's awesome. But the prohibition for bishul akum is only on something that's not edible raw, and something that also is edible that you would serve at a king's table. But something that you would not serve at a king's table, or is edible raw, would not need to be made bishul yisrael. Just before I take a question, I want to make one more point clear. So, for example, things like snack foods, for example, popcorn, even though you don't eat the corn raw, but popcorn as a food, especially the way it's made, is not a chashuv of food. The snack food, you wouldn't serve it at a king's table. You wouldn't serve it at a wedding. It would be considered embarrassing, and therefore, it doesn't have to be made b'shul Yisrael. There's a whole discussion about some other snack foods. Sometimes it gets into a bit of a gray area. We can discuss it, but I'll take your question first.
Yeah, wait, so then the food only needs to fit, like with the popcorn example, only needs to fit one of them. Like popcorn, technically, you can't eat it raw, but you wouldn't serve it at the king's.
Correct. It has to have one of the qualifications, and that's enough to exempt it from bishul Yisrael. Either one of the qualifications. Yeah. So another example. Let's talk about Pringles, one of the 4 basic food groups in the American diet. The Pringles are made through a dehydration process. They cook the potatoes and they dehydrate them, make them not edible, and then they reconstitute it with water in a certain shape. And that's why all Pringles come out to be the exact same shape. They don't grow that way. Trust me, they're manufactured that way. And they're also, the bracha changes because it's dehydrated and then rehydrated, so it's like panum chadash, it's like a new entity. It's actually a bracha shahakol. Whereas a potato chip is made differently. It's made from a sliced potato that's deep fried. So that's straight away from the potato, and the bracha would remain on Adama. So we don't say this idea that it's removed from its original source as much. So there's a whole discussion in halacha when we speak about this laws that's something that's not edible in the raw state, or something that you wouldn't serve at a king's table. Do we look at the origin of the food or the way the food is being served at this moment? So with regards to a potato chip, it's a fascinating question because the origin of the potato chip is a potato. A potato is not edible raw. And if you bake a potato and make it, roast it in a royal way, it would be something that would be served at a king's table. It would have to be made b'shul Yisrael. So the question is, what about potato chips? Do they have to be made b'shul Yisrael? Now, the lenient side of things, the lenient opinion would hold it's true that a potato chip comes from a potato, and a potato is not edible in the raw state. But the way the potato chip is made now, as a chip, it's made as a snack food. You would never serve it at a fancy venue, and therefore it's not going to bring about a feeling of closeness because you wouldn't serve it at a fancy event. And therefore, would not have to be made b'shul Yisrael. But the stringent approach says no, but it's coming from a potato. The origin of a potato is that it would be, as a potato would have to be made b'shul Yisrael, and it's not edible raw, and therefore potato chip should be made b'shul Yisrael. It is a machlokas. There are different opinions about it. So what one should do, if you're living in a place where you can get b'shul Yisrael potato chips, then it's certainly considered to be proper and praiseworthy to be stringent. If you're living in a place where you cannot get bishli yisrael potato chips, one has who to rely on if you want to be lenient, and some people are still stringent. It depends on a person's custom.
What does the Bishul Yisrael like symbol look like on food? It's different than like the kosher action.
Sometimes they'll say BY, but if it has a Hamish Hashkacha, it'll just write Bishul Yisrael, right straight up. But if it's a national brand, they typically don't write the word Bishul Yisrael. You may have to find out. If they make it Bishul Yisrael, most potato chips on the national scale, the national brands are not made Bishul Yisrael. 99% of them are not made that way. There was a brand years ago, the Terra chips were made Bishul Yisrael for a while under the Kaf K. They were trying to be sensitive for those that are machmir to that, but eventually the company said it was too hard to do. They were no longer able to provide that. I told you about my achlata, right, Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, so it was good begashmi, but I still eat the Bishul Yisrael potato chips, so it didn't help me too much.
Story. Your colleague, when he spoke to us last year, told us a story that like some shliach would always call like Buckingham Palace and ask if they serve something.
Yeah.
To see if it was.
Yeah. That's funny. It's interesting because I had a client of mine. He retired already. His name was Chef. That was his nickname. He was a professional chef, and he used to cook for state dinners. So he cooked for events that had 5,500 people. So when I had a question whether or not something was considered chashuv, I'd ask him. I'm like, that's his omnus, that's his profession. I asked him if they serve anything from a can. Generally speaking, the answer was no. There were maybe a couple of exceptions, but it was interesting to talk to him because I got a sense of what that kind of environment was like. Now, in Dalit, it's interesting because it depends on the country that you're in. In some countries, certain things are more chashuv than others. For example, in America, it's not common to find corn served at a wedding. I wouldn't say it's impossible to find, not common. But in Eretz Yisrael, I'm told that it is common. So there is a slight variation. Or, for example, in Mexico, my understanding is that tortillas or those things are very much a mainstream food, and they probably would be considered chashuv there. In America, not necessarily. It's more of a fast food. Again, there's slight variations, and that would depend on which country you're now. Another part of this discussion, which is very fascinating, is what happens if something's manufactured in a certain country that would consider that food to be chashuv, but it's manufactured for export, and it's going to a country which doesn't consider that to be chashuv. But the general answer is we go after where it's manufactured. It's manufactured in a place that considers it to be a chashuv food, has to be made Bishul Yisrael. Okay. Davar anechal k'moishu chaya, food that's edible in the raw state. She'etiru chacham, that the Rabbi said it's permissible even if a non-Jew cooks it. Totally b'minhag achilas b'nei adam. It depends on what the custom is in that particular locale. Imrui b'nei adam, most people only eat this food when it's cooked. Even though you have an individual who's going to eat it raw, but will die. That person's particular preference or their, the way of doing things does not carry weight. And even for that person, the food would be usher if the non-Jew cooked it. The same would be in the reverse. Most people eat a certain food raw, an individual only eats it cooked. But their knowledge, their whole approach gets nullified in the masses. The food is also permissible for that person. If in a certain country, a certain food is edible raw, in a different country, it's not edible raw, like the example I gave you before. I was told way back when in Europe, I don't know what it's like today, but this colleague of mine was probably talking about what happened in the 50s or the 40s. It was not edible raw. You go after the minhag of the country that you're in. So if then in Europe people did not eat carrots raw, then carrots would have to be made b'shli Yisrael. They'd be subject to those laws. But in America, carrots are edible raw, therefore they don't have to be made b'shli Yisrael. Halacha hey, a food that would be served at a king's table. Again, I mean, it refers to a fancy venue. Tolegam came bisman of makom. It also depends on the place and the time of that one's in. It's hard to deduce from the halachic authorities in the Svardim exactly what's called El Hashochem Malachim today. What's not Ela today. Kevan Shamach Lanoshim Chashuv Maz Inadem Lachol Hayim. So the types of foods that people ate back then are not the same type of food that people eat today. So there are slight variations, but the general theme is the same. If it's the kind of food that would be of a chashuv in nature, it would have to be made b'shel Yisrael. Now we're getting into a fascinating discussion. What about sushi? Sushi. It was invented by two Jewish people. They wanted to open a restaurant without a kitchen. It's a Jackie Mason joke. Sorry. But what about sushi? So you have sushi, they have, I don't know what they call it, surimi. I don't eat this stuff, but I eat the vegetable sushi, but the raw fish is not really my thing. So they're saying, well, raw fish seems to be, it was made popular some years ago. It got introduced to the Jewish world, and it hasn't left. So you have surimi, all different levels. You have sushi, surimi, and you got all kinds of toppings, nicest things are happening. So the general answer to this question is that it's not enough of a raya proof that fish is edible raw. First of all, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, you don't see people. I mean, there are people that exist that do this, but it's not what I would call commonplace in society for someone to go catch a fish, skin it, and just eat it. It's not happening. We haven't seen that yet. Although we might come there one day, but we're not there. And even sushi, those that are eating it raw are eating it with what's called tipple. It's going through a whole prep process, and they cut it and basically they put it together with other things, and it's eaten together with other foods. I wouldn't say majority of Americans are eating the raw fish by themselves. I certainly wouldn't try that. So therefore, fish would still be subject to the requirements of Bishul Yisrael, although it is possible to marinate a raw fish, and it can become ready to eat through marination, like a pickling process. And I still remember the day, this is many years ago, probably 20 plus years ago, my wife and I were in Florida. And Bachrim Bechlal have a different idea of how foods operate. When I was a Bachar, I thought pineapple grew in a can. So I used to eat it from the can. My wife said to me, no, you talking about this. She showed me, you cut the pineapple and you have fresh pineapple. Bachrim don't deal with these things for the most part. But anyway, so we went to a restaurant. My wife is she's trying to expand my culinary delectables. She's trying to help me expand my horizons. She convinced me to have fish that was not cooked. It was, but it was marinated overnight with some kind of a sauce, some kind of a flavoring. And I have to say, it was pretty good, and it didn't taste not cooked. So that's why I was able to eat it. It didn't really bother me. It was very soft. I guess it got marinated, kind of somehow cured it, whatever. But that's okay. That's called curing, and that would not actually have to be made b'shul Yisrael because it's not called cooking. But that's still not a proof that a raw fish without any kind of activity is edible in its raw state.
The sushi does need to be b'shul Yisrael?
Yeah, and actually, and the rice that surrounds the sushi has to be cooked by a Jew, and that's also one of the trickier parts of the sushi process because rice cookers typically are plugged in, and therefore you don't have a burning pilot. So a Jew has to turn on the rice cooker every time they're going to cook the rice. So what they do in restaurants in order to prevent a situation where a non-Jew mistakenly might turn on the rice cooker without a Jew realizing, is they often have plug locks. They'll lock the plug of the cooker just so no mistake doesn't happen. If the mashgiach is like roaming all over the place, he has to be called to come and turn on the rice cooker. A friend of mine told me a story that happened, and it's a very impressive story actually. Sad, a little sad for some people, but it's impressive. So he was a mashgiach at a venue. I think it was a very, very fancy bar mitzvah many, many years ago, like 25 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago. And he forgot to turn on the rice cooker for the sushi. He made the mistake. But he owned up to it. He called up the Rav HaMachshir and he said, I forgot to turn the rice cooker on. I don't know why. It just slipped my mind. They made a whole ton of sushi and they couldn't serve it. People weren't happy, but that's the halacha. So It's something that does need a lot of attention. Have to be handled properly. Okay, any questions on what we said so far? Oh, okay, so now,
Yeah, actually,
yeah.
one question.
Go ahead.
Wait, for sushi being visually roll, like, does that mean like however the sushi's because at the end, like it's just rolled, but like that could be by a non-Jew, it just needs to be half.
Yes, the rice cooker would have to be turned on by a Jew. And
However the fish is prepared.
if the fish is raw, it doesn't have to be made by a Jew. If a fish is going to be fried, then the Jew would have to turn on the fryer.
Okay, it just means they have to be the rice.
But it also means the fact that some people would eat the fish raw in that kind of environment and that kind of format, it's not a proof that a person would eat raw fish the way it is. That's my point. But you're right, if everything was raw about the sushi, and let's say someone took sushi without rice, just had, I don't know, what they call surimi, sashimi, I don't know, these names scare me. Just the name itself scares me.
Oh, whatever.
Sashimi, surimi, these names are Rimis, the Rimi family. Then if there's no rice, then and it's all raw, it's all raw. But Nandra can make that as long as it's in a kosher environment and in the proper way, it's okay. What's fascinating about these halachas also is that, generally speaking, we say that prohibited material is nullified in permissible material at a ratio of 1 in 60.
Mhm.
For most prohibitions. Some prohibitions need a higher ratio also. But with regards to the Isser of Bishul Akum, because it's a rabbinic prohibition, they were more lenient, and they said if you have the majority of the food, it's permissible. If the non-Bishul Yisrael food got mixed in by mistake and is no longer discernible, then it would be permissible to eat. For example, let's say somebody made a vegetable soup and they put in potatoes and carrots, celery, and water and spices. So the carrots, the celery, the water, and the spice are all edible raw. But the potatoes are not. The potato was a minority ingredient, it's only 20%. And then it got pureed. You cannot see any more potato. So then that food will be permissible to eat even if it was cooked by a non-Jew, because the majority of the food is nechal kameshul chai, could be edible raw. And the food that was not edible raw, in this case, the potatoes, are not discernible by themselves anymore because they've been pureed. If it's discernible, you're not allowed to eat them. You have to take them out. Yeah.
So cooked means heated up, or cooked means just prepared?
Well, when I say cooked, I mean cooked from raw to finish. Heated up is a separate thing. A non-Jew is allowed to heat up food that was already cooked b'shul Yisrael, made b'shul Yisrael. Which means if you have food that was already cooked by a Jew, let's say you're going to a catered venue and they're going to have the chafing dishes, a non-Jew is allowed to light the lighting gel. As a policy, we have the Jews light them because we don't want to train the non-Jews to light the fires because they can come to light the fire and then fry an egg, which would be a problem. But technically speaking, they're allowed to warm up food that's already been cooked by a Jew. No, that's not prohibited. Someone mixed in foods that are edible raw, the foods that have to be cooked. We go after the majority of the food. Most of the food is the type of food that's edible in the raw state of Israel, and the non-Jew cooks it is permissible because the majority is foods that you could be edible raw. Even if they're exactly equal, allowed to eat. We said it's nullified in the majority. We're talking about the Michael Asr, or in the first case, the food that needs to be cooked, where it's not discernible on its own. Because if it's discernible on its own, it has to be removed. Because then it wouldn't qualify. Now there's another thing that was a halacha about the Beis Yisrael. Ishlai di Nochri V'Vesa Yisrael. Yesh min harishonim shehitir ma shebishal hanochri b'gufur. There are some rishonim that permit what a non-Jew cooks in a Jew's home, kilei shayach by chashashis chatnos, because the concern of intermarriage does not exist there. Even shaloi yavay Yisrael lechem v'Vesa Nochri, because the Yid's not going to come to eat in a non-Jew's home because it's in a Jew's home already. It's a Jewish environment. Most poskim do not agree with this particular position. They say it's not enough of a ground to be lenient. Halacha is not like this opinion. The shita of Avram ben David and Tosfos. In a situation where a non-Jew cooks in a Jew's home, even if a Jew sees it, also one would not allow to be eat such food. But if there's other mitigating situations, other mitigating factors, sometimes that could go into the calculation. Can ask the by love. Any questions?
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
I'm just,
Are you feeling overwhelmed by it?
I'm just like confused. I just have like a lot of situational questions. There's this trend that was on TikTok. It was like, oh, I'm a this, so I do this. So one of the things they were gonna do is, oh, I'm a bal tshuva, of course I do this. One of the examples of course, every time I cook, I call it Rub. You know, like
It's interesting because the art of the bal tshuva experience, I learned this from my father, is to absorb Yiddishkeit and to really be deeply connected to it, but also to find the balance. Balance is hard to find because you're coming from the other extreme to come back to it. And my father was blessed with that. He had that balance. It was very like middle road in how he lived his life, but very deeply connected to the Rebbe at the same time. But really, there's an answer from the Rebbe. The Rebbe told somebody, that kind of addresses your question. He said he encouraged somebody to speak about kashrus from the Sheikh Chabad from the Babbage community of women. So the person said to the Rebbe, "These people are God-fearing women, leading households. What am I going to tell them already? Like the religious women." So the Rebbe said they're being machmir on things they don't have to be machmir on. They're being stringent on things they don't have to be stringent on, but they're also being makel, being lenient on things they shouldn't be lenient on. So when we get equipped with knowledge is power, and we can focus our energy where it's meant to be focused. And it also brings balance because we don't have to be concerned about things that we thought previously were of a concern. So it cuts both ways. Now, practically speaking, when it comes to having domestic help in the house, it should be done carefully and with responsibility. It should be done responsibly. What does that look like? That looks like and this happens in almost all kosher restaurants. It also happens in most kosher homes. They have non-Jewish household help. So they do prep work. So let's say someone helping out in the home, she can cut all the vegetables, she can prepare them. But the turning on the fire is done by the Jew or Jewess, or one of the adult children in the home, whatever is available. So we generally teach them that turning on the fire has to be handled by somebody in the family who's Jewish. They can do some prep work. And also it's important to make sure that they're well taken care of, first of all, for the menschlichkeit, because that's the right thing to do, but also for kashrus reasons, if you make sure that you give them food, to take care of them so they have their needs met, they're going to have a lunch, they're not going to be bringing in their non-kosher food into your home. It's not going to cause any complications. That's an important point. In fact, one of the things that I look for when they set up a factory for kashrus, and make sure that they have a dedicated lunchroom, eating area for employees. They can have their refrigerator, a microwave, a toaster, they can have their personal food, and therefore there's no incentive to bring personal food in the manufacturing area, which they shouldn't be doing for quality reasons also, but I want to make sure that they're totally incentivized to do what's right, not be tempted otherwise. You ready for one more story? It was stopping halacha test. It's a story with the Chaim Reiser. It's not a story. There was in the 1930s, there was a leader of the Jewish world, the literature world. His name was Chaim Reiser Grodemsky, I think his last name was. He was a tremendous Torah scholar. And he was ambidextrous. He was able to write two letters at the same time, one with his right hand, one with his left hand, and somehow correct. Don't ask me how he did that. But anyway, he met a Polish Rebbe. His name was the Oster Soviet Rebbe. Was a very frail, a small person, Begashmit, giant. He used to fast a lot. So he said to him, Lema Ma Milsa, let me hear a word from you, let me hear something from you. So the Oster Soviet Rebbe tells Rabbi Mezer a whole pilpul and halacha, a whole scholarly discussion from the Talmud. And afterwards, Rabbi Mezer enjoyed it so much, he says to the Oster Soviet Rebbe, you're a great man. So Oster Soviet Rebbe says to Rabbi Mezer, and then when I got Rabbi, that's what makes someone great. I'll tell you how someone becomes great. Tells him another story. He says the Gemara in Makkos has a whole discussion. I'm not sure, telling me that I should turn this off. The Gemara in Makkos has a whole discussion. The Torah says, Abraham Yakenu, that someone who does something wrong gets up to 40 lashes. 40 lashes. And the Chachamim, the rabbis derive that up to 40, not 40, they get 39. It's the max punishment they can get is 39 lashes. Adar boy, not 40. So the Gemara says, Kama tipshi inshi, how foolish are people, but they stand up for a Sefer Torah, but they won't stand up for such a great Torah scholar. Because the Torah scholars have the koyach, the darshan in Torah itself, to derive what the Torah is saying. So they have that greatness. So the Asaf Rebbe says to Rabbi Chaim Mezer, I don't understand this Gemara. He says, Gemara is teaching us that stand up for a Torah scholar, they have the koyach, the darshan in Torah itself. We have the same limud by Sfiras Omer. It says in the Torah, Tizberu Chamisha B'Yayim, count 50 days, and we derive you have to count 49 days. And the other Gemara doesn't say how great are the rabbis that they have the koyach, the darshan in Torah itself. That when it says 50, it means up to 50. It's only 49. How come? So he says, Aveknem and ein makeh la Rasha. Take away one makeh, one lashes from a Jew, a wicked Jew. From them, such obvious Yisrael, that's how your person becomes great. That's great. And then it says Kislev, it's Yom. But tomorrow it starts with Yoim Hisvados, the Kabbalah Achlotas Tevis. It's Rosh Tevis, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Yoim Hisvados, the Kabbalah Achlotas Tevis. Or B'chayis Nafshim Nitin Lon, it's Fidish Yom Tiv. It's Lashon Teva, Tikos Tevis, Sichotim. To all be connected to the true wellspring of life with joy and happiness and inner simcha. Good job.
Thank you.
I was probably to be that story, but like I knew you were coming back and they were like, that's so